Good afternoon. Hello, Ephraim. Nice to have you.
Good afternoon.
All right, and so we're doing the Latinos and Turner's West, right? And so I don't know, have you had a chance, Ephraim, to take a look at the handout yet?
No.
It's okay. That's what you're here for, right? So if you take a look at it here, right? Number one tries to support Frederick Jackson Turner's thesis on the West, and it's a very romanticized thesis, right? He claims that the West renewed American equality of opportunity, what he calls meritocracy. You write like the word merecer in Spanish. You rise or fall on merit, on whether you earn or deserve it. And so he contends that the West provided an equal playing field for everybody, and that it posed dangers as well as opportunities that were rather open to everybody and did not discriminate. So, for instance, with the dangers, right? It's kind of the part of like the hero's journey, according to Joseph Campbell. Um, the idea that nothing ventured, nothing gained. That attaining the American dream when it is dangerous is all the more laudable, right? It's all the more praiseworthy to become rich and successful in the midst of many hardships. And so that's part of his thesis, right? And you look at a guy named Robert Stewart during the War of 1812. He went backwards. He went from Oregon back to the East Coast, back to Missouri, and along pretty much the future Oregon Trail. And it's just all the stereotypical dangers that I and my generation am familiar with a game a long time ago in the 1980s called Oregon Trail. Um, but you have like the fact that at one time some of his men drank their own urine for lack of sufficient water to drink, and went without food in great privations. Conditions of weather, um, being extorted by Crow Native Americans on more than one occasion, attacks from wild animals, the threat of mutiny amongst his men, disagreeing on what paths to take and when to rest, and just what kind of MO to follow heading east. Just a lot of the things that you hear about or see depicted through Hollywood, etc., on the overland trails you find in his story. And so, you have the Platte, the Columbia, the Snake Rivers, where a lot of people drowned. You have Candy Moulton and other old school historians who get into stats on people being gored or killed by wild bison and roaming cattle and steer, etc. You have the extremities of weather during the winter in the Rockies and the Sierra Nevada, where things freeze up and you can get 10 feet of snow in a given, a short period of time, and the weather gets below 50 degrees zero. At times it has. And so at any rate, those types of dangers on the overland trail are apparent. They're in primary source records of people that have traveled across them, namely the Oregon and the Santa Fe trails, and then the Mormon or California Trail off the Oregon Trail. And I have a picture of them right here. Actually, not the Santa Fe, sorry. I should have had one with all three depicted on it. But then once they got here, then you have a problem with temporary anarchy, especially in California, where President Polk did not follow the Northwest ordinances to the T by any stretch of the imagination. And he allowed people to kind of just trespass to try to take the Mexican land in the 1840s during the gold rush. And the timing of the gold rush was awful for the Californios, the ethnic Mexican Californians, because the end of the war was February 2nd, 1848, and they found gold just 8 days before that on January 24th. There, the famous diggings there under John Sutter's property by Mormon workers. And so, yeah, and so you have a general state of anarchy in which he contends that, under the Northwest ordinances, you're supposed to put everything in 6 square acre plots. So many of them make up a municipality, a city, and then so many of them make up a county, and some of them make up the state. And you're to have, police and sheriff offices. All that was bypassed. And so there was a time period in which, to this day, when you go into gold mining country, they literally have hanging trees because there was a lack of law and order and institutions like police force, etc., during the gold rush. And so just a couple quotes here from Vigilantes and Gold Rush San Francisco. This is by vigilante Robert Lamont. In 1851. It is well known that within the last 12 months, 54 murders have been committed in San Francisco alone, not one of which has ever been punished. And in some cases, the perpetrators have never undergone the least investigation. Then the next one is by vigilante Robert Lamont, again, just about almost exactly a month later. And he says, since the formation of a vigilance committee or vigilante committee in San Francisco, crime has diminished at a most wonderful rate. Scarcely a burglary, robbery, murder, gunshot, or theft is heard of in this city. I'm certainly not trying to convey any kind of a subjective support for vigilantism. My point being is that there is evidence for a rough and tumble West, and that supports his thesis, is that it was rough and tough for everyone, supposedly. And so it made the quest for the American dream all the more romanticized when you attained it. All right, just a second here. But then you can get into testimonies about opportunities. So for one, the one that stands out the most for me is entrepreneurial. If you were quick on your feet heading to the West or living in the West, you found opportunities of business. Just providing a service or a product that was in demand. And so, following the railroads, in the 1860s, the Transcontinental Railroad, and others that will come in the subsequent decades, you find people, developing new cities, new Western towns, etc. And so you have people begin a myriad of businesses. Things that, everything from the bare necessities, food, clothing, shelter, tools. Oh my goodness, just tools for the gold miners. You have people like Sam Brannan, who virtually monopolized, pickaxes and shovels, etc. And they were able to sell them at exorbitant rates to the miners, because a lot of the miners came in haste without even bringing tools with them. And so you could quote mine the miners and find something that was in demand by them as they're moving into the West. Of course, you have the famous brothels and bars and casinos and all kinds of other services, an inn for people to stay, have their clothes washed, have a meal, etc. And so there were ways, right? If you could find at least a little bit of capital, a little bit of money to begin with, to And of course, loans became available through San Francisco quite early in the gold rush by the mid 1850s. And then you also have the mineral rushes in the West. And the most famous that we're talking about chronologically here is the gold rush. And let me give you a couple quotes here from the famous J.S. Holiday book, The World Rushed In, on the gold rush. I have here, let's see here, Governor Mason, a military governor. Let's see here. Says here, no capital is required to obtain this gold. It's on page 40. And then let's see here. Has here, many of the miners worked rockers and washed $100 worth of gold each day in the diggings along the North Fork. They found, et cetera, et cetera. And it says he estimated the total production at 30,000 to 50,000 per day, if not more. That was Governor Mason's report. And he says there is room and enough for all to come. But you have to remember, this was in 1848, before the huge rush of over 80,000 came just legally along the Oregon Trail in 1849 alone. But if you were here early, the pickings were there, the placer or superficial level diggings right in the riverbeds. And it didn't take a lot of capital. It didn't take a lot of expertise. It didn't take much in machinery to extract that wealth. And you have that in La Alta California and other newspapers in California at that time that attest to Governor Mason's report. So with number one, we're setting it up, right, with this romantic thesis that the West renewed meritocracy, that it was equally dangerous for everybody, but that they were equal opportunities for everybody. If you were, it kind of employs almost Darwinian undertones. If you were tough enough, if you were quick and adaptive enough, if you were, savvy, business savvy enough, you could make it in this rough and tumble West. Then number two is conflict history, right? And remember, conflict history looks at conflict in history, looks at power plays by different demographics, and it oftentimes tries to elicit sympathy for those who lost. And that's what we're doing with number two, is we're demonstrating the fact that for Latinos in particular, there was no equality of opportunity. They were victimized by racism in the mid to late 1800s. So I try to set the stage with different markers as far as the voice of the people. So newspapers, elected politicians, etc. And so look at the newspaper, the New York Herald here. It depicted Mexican people as imbeciles, degraded by miscegenation, right? Interethnic sex. And of course, they're talking about the Spanish blood being mixed with the indigenous or Native American blood, as a quote, mestizo people. Let's see here. The first Anglo governor exclaimed that a war of extermination will continue to be waged between the races. Yikes. Charles Benton, governor of New Mexico, declared the Mexican character is made up of stupidity, obstinacy or stubbornness, ignorance, duplicity, and vanity. Yikes, right? And I try to say that it's part of a larger theme at this time period, a larger American trend in the 1800s to classify non-WASP, that is white Anglo-Saxon Protestant. Remember, the Angles and Saxons took over England. So you're namely talking about English American white Anglo people, into a hierarchy of inferior races. Scientists at this time, claims historian Erica Lee, categorized humanity into different racial groups by ascribing inherited and immutable characteristics to them, such as the Irish Celtic people being inferior, so many of them coming in the 1840s with the potato famine, etc. So, but then oftentimes, right, and then remember, immutable, that's the thing. is if you arrogantly believe that you are superior to another ethnic group or nationality because of circumstances, that's harmful enough. What can come from that type of arrogance? But at least there's some saving grace in the whole nature versus nurture argument, that you believe that they are inferior because of nurture, not nature, right? Because they have been under an archaic system under Spain, for instance, and they haven't had the opportunity for self-government, as the arguably the Anglo-Americans had more latitude, and that's Whig history. That's definitely bent history. But at least you believe there's hope for the Latino people, that they just haven't had the opportunity yet to be independent and to be enterprising economically, etc. But when you believe that their characteristics are negative and that those characteristics are innate, that they're just biologically embedded in them, then there's no hope. There's no hope of them bettering their position, of them improving their disposition and their qualities and attributes and behavior, because after all, right, you've dehumanized them as an other group, and in your estimation, there's no hope. They're not going to change. And then add to that the fact that there was a tendency to use certain demographics as scapegoats. A lot of conspiracy theories percolated in the 1800s in America. So as you see here, for instance, conspiracy theories against Eastern bankers and merchants, against federal workers or bureaucrats, against Mormons, and against particularly Catholics. And this type of xenophobia, right? This fearful hatred of outsiders. So you see here in the mid-1800s, violent anti-Catholic riots occurred in Louisville, Kentucky, Philadelphia, New York, Boston, Chicago, St. Louis, Cincinnati, and New Orleans. In Louisville, the rumor had circulated that the Pope had dictated German and Irish Catholics' votes, told them who to vote for, and that they had stored arms and ammunition in a local Catholic church to use, right, should their candidates lose the election. And of course, that all was absolutely untrue. No arms or ammunition was found in any of the Catholic churches. But this type of crazy, tendency to attack scapegoats, right, for as I have here, for of others, for America's social, political, and economic ills, ran rampant, supposedly, in the 1800s. And General Zachary Taylor and General Winfield Scott was the man in charge of the American military during the Mexican-American War. And he was concerned, right, about atrocities that American soldiers were imposing upon the Mexican people and Mexico itself when American armed forces invaded Mexico from 1846 to 48 in the Mexican-American War. Look what he says here. He says that American war crimes against Mexican people would make heaven weep. That was his quote. Like raping Mexican women in the sight of tied up Mexican men. So yikes, right? So as you see here, different like voices of the people, arguably. Look at some of these elected politicians, for instance. Ex-Mississippi governor to California politician Henry Stewart Foote. Extermination may be necessary for the peace of California. And so, oh my gosh, right? It's bad enough. It's bad enough, seen as a solution, killing. This is genocide, killing the Hispanic people, but then using a dehumanizing noun, extermination, right? You murder human beings, but you exterminate rodents and pests. Adolf Hitler and the Third Reich used extermination as a term for the non-members of their people's community, particularly the Jews. So that's scary stuff. Thomas Jefferson Green, who was behind the foreign miners taxes against Hispanics here in California. He compared killing Hispanics to killing lice. Yankee Francis Parkman said that the Mexican people are squalid, mean, miserable, slavish, and degenerate. I find that very interesting, is the contradictory nature of some of these stereotypes. Because on the one hand, right, you see evidence of Anglos being afraid of Latino men, claiming that they're violent and criminally prone. But then in this other one, it says that they're pusillanimous, that they're cowardly and too timid. The fact that they wanted to utilize Mexican Americans as their day laborers and as the members of their proletariat, their manual laborers who get their hands dirty from day to day, blue collar workers, right? But then to say that they're slavish, that they're lazy, it's strange to me how you have such a paradox when it comes to the stereotypes of two seemingly, opposite adjectives. And so Stephen Austin called the Mexican American people mongrels, and of course that's a terrible word for an ethnic mixture of people. Again, Spanish and indigenous. And Caleb Cushing said, race is the key to all of Mexico's failures, is the fact that they're biologically a mixed people. And then in 1855, just after, not long after the war, 7 years after the war, the Know Nothing Party elected a governor over California. And the Know Nothings, or the party of the Star Spangled Banner, were overtly a racist political party. Against non-WASP demographics, against immigrants, against Catholics, and against Latinos and African Americans. So yikes, right? Then you get up to the actual fighting and what happens during the war, right? And after the war. And you have, the taking of land. That's another one. Is according to the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, right? The Mexican American people, as they say, right, they didn't cross the border crossed them. So now they find themselves in Los Estados Unidos, right, in the US, formerly Mexico territory, here in Arizona, New Mexico, Colorado, California, just before the war, at the beginning of the war, Texas, annexed by the US. And so they're supposed to be guaranteed their citizenship rights. Okay. But that just doesn't fly. The Texas and California in particular implemented their own committees and political not parties, but political committees to carry out the arbitration, right? Being a referee, the arbitration of land ownership. And so in California and in Texas, you have a very, very conflict history oriented story that arises, that shows, bad guys bullying victims. And of course, the victims are the Hispanic people. And so a good source on that, Chicano history historian, is Felipe Fernandez Armesto, Our America. That's one good source on this topic that I used. But my goodness, you just have a myriad of examples in his book of different people deprived of that. So let's see what I have here. The California land. First of all, look at Napoleon Dana and Edward Dwyer in Texas. They said, we need to frighten, terrorize, and if need be, exterminate the ethnic Mexican Tejanos into selling their land. The California Land Commission from 1852 to 56, 20 to 25%. And I was surprised that it was that low. I thought it was higher than that. But that's a quarter, right? A quarter of the Hispanic landowners in California land was lost to Anglos. Don Manuel Dominguez lost the lion's share of his vast properties. And then you have Francisco Ramirez's LA newspaper, El Clamor Público, right? Like the public outcry. And he gives evidence of that time period, right? It was going on right then and there, of the Anglos extorting the Californios, literally, blackmailing them and forcing them, threatening them with something over their heads if they should not sell their lands. And General Riley, Mason's contemporary or successor as the military commander over newly Anglo-American California, said that the profits and lands were all going into Anglo's hands, according to this source that I just cited. So for one, they made it very difficult for, in California in particular, they made it very difficult to prove your ownership of land. They wanted longitude and latitude lines as far as your property boundaries. They wanted a signature and a date as far as when and by whom you or your ancestors had been allotted that land. And a lot of them, right, the land had been given to them by like Pedro Fages, who was a Spanish governor at the time of the establishment of the California missions in the 1770s. So a lot of years, several decades had gone by, so that a lot of people didn't have it handy with them, the proper paperwork to prove the exact boundaries of their property and by whom or from whom that their families had been given that. And so when they could not adequately prove it in court, they lost it. They at least lost the outside peripheral boundaries of their property. Then there were cases in Texas in which, like, Richard King and some of the big cattle barons continually put, like, what was it with the Espiritu Santo land grant case. That was the name of the cattle ranch owned by a Latino owner, and he was repeatedly taken to court over his land. And he finally gets a moment with his Anglo opponent and tells him, I have the paperwork. I have rightfully, and I and my family and ancestors have rightfully held this property for generations. Why are you repeatedly taking me to court? And the gentleman just openly boasted and said, I can afford the court costs better than you can. And so basically they're just trying to bully him into, because some things haven't changed to this day, right? However many hundreds of dollars just to speak and to get the advice of an attorney. It's several hundred just for 1 hour on a contemporary basis here. And then you have them representing you in court, filing petitions, etc. It was a very, very costly procedure. And the Anglo corporate guys knew that. And so sometimes they just repeatedly took the Latino owners to court to try to bludgeon them, if you will, into submission, into going broke, paying for lawyer fees, etc. And then you had some shyster attorneys who misrepresented the Latinos. And so there were a myriad of reasons for which the Latino people lost large portions of their land, despite the promises of the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo. All right. And then you have the foreign miners taxes and the discrimination during the gold rush. The foreign miners tax of $20 per month for non-citizens, aimed primarily against Hispanic and Asian miners. You had 1850 and 1852 foreign miners taxes of $3. 1855 taxing passengers ineligible for citizenship, that was aimed toward the Chinese. 1858, Act to prevent the further immigration of Mongolians or Chinese. So those are the two main demographics that were discriminated against in Gold Rush, California, and in the mid 1800s in the West were the Asians and the Hispanics. And what do you know, right? They were coming in large numbers, but there was resentment toward the Hispanics in particular on a couple grounds. As for one, time of war exacerbates ethnic tensions, to say the least. The Mexican and the Anglo-American people are literally killing one another from 1846 to 1848 in the Mexican-American War, fighting in battle. And so then there was a sense of, we have won California fair and square by winning the Mexican-American War. And so hence you have forfeited your opportunities to extract the wealth of this land because it's now under the US flag. So there was that justification by Anglos. And then there's also anger that a lot of Hispanic miners beat them to the punch. In 1848 alone, like I said, you had people coming from Sonora and Sinaloa and other areas of northern Mexico that beat the Americans to the gold fields coming from the East Coast. You also had the Chileans, and the Chileans not only came very quickly and soon and received publicity for their success in the mines, but they also were very adept at mining. They used quicksilver or mercury and used certain methods that were very state-of-the-art for the time. And so hence there was envy and jealousy of their success. And so, and then with the Asian count, in 1848, the California census counted 54 Asians, 54 in California. By 3 years later, in 1851, there were over 25,000 in the census. And so most of them came on account of the Taiping Rebellion and the Opium Wars. Most of them came from the Guangdong province, and they came in such a large onrush, and they also received good publicity through the Transcontinental Railroad. There was a famous bet by Charles Crocker of the Central Pacific that his Chinese miners could build 10 miles of track in a single day. And that wager ended with over 10,000 Chinese immigrants being allotted the task of building the western end of the Transcontinental Railroad from Sacramento eastward into Utah. And they developed a reputation for being the ideal worker, for being one adjective they used was docile, doing as you're told, being very meek or manso, and for being very efficient or very quick in their work and being very thorough. And so it's ironic that when you look at some of the anti-Chinese legislation that was passed, and you have quite a bit of it from the 1860s through the 1880s, including, of course, the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882, they actually cite those positive stereotypes as the Chinese being the ideal worker, and hence they're taking jobs from American workers. And so there was that type of, again, envy or jealousy, fear of losing their jobs to these demographics. And at times they were pitted against one another, the Hispanics and the Asians, where you had Hispanics in Denver attack the Chinese laborers for taking their jobs in like 1864 or something like that. So at any rate, you have the economic dimension to everything as well. But you piece it all together, right? And number two just does not coalesce with number one. And that was my intended argument, was that, okay, Turner's thesis at superficial glance, it makes a little bit of sense as far as, equal dangers and equal opportunities, that were kind of indiscriminately there for the toughest and the smartest, best improvisers, and those best at adapting to new circumstances. But it does not take account of this information we're going over here in number 2, of just outright racial discrimination and racism. And yeah. So does anybody have any questions or comments?
No.
So do we write based on document number 1 or document number 2?
So what I'd like you to do, and I need to make that clear. Thank you for asking that, Ephraim. But I'd like you to kind of blend them together. But mainly I want you to work on number 2. I want you, that as the class is Mexican American history. That was a great question. I want you to analyze and evaluate number 2, but I want you to do it in light of number 1. So yeah, I need to make that clear on the, I'll probably send out an announcement to the class on Canvas, making that more clear.
Okay.
All right. Do you guys feel relatively confident in your kind of command over the material, your digestion of the gist of what I meant to convey on this assignment?
Yes.
Thank you. Because yeah, if you don't, please don't be shy. Please don't be bashful to let me know if I haven't made something clear. That's what I'm here for. But yeah, if you don't have any other questions, that's basically it. And I have both your names. You'll get your extra credit that you have certainly earned, added to your raw score on this assignment. And I want to thank you for coming. I appreciate it, especially just with being 2 of you. I appreciate the 2 of you all the more. All right. All right. So if there aren't any questions, the 2 of you, I'm going to go ahead and bid you adieu. Okay.
Okay. Bye.
Bye. You guys have a great week. Okay. Be safe.
You too.